Kia ora. Welcome to Campfire Stories. My name is Rose from Christchurch City Libraries, and I'm reading Agatha Christie's The Moving Finger. At this stage, Mrs. Symington's had her inquest, and Amy Griffith's come over to gossip, and Jerry has realised she doesn't like his sister. We've all wondered how you could both bear to bury yourselves in such an out-of-the-way spot. It was a question, and I answered it. Doctor's orders. I was to come somewhere very quiet where nothing ever happened. I paused and added, not quite true of Lymstock now. No, indeed. She sounded worried and got up to go. She said then, you know, it's got to be put a stop to, all this beastliness. We can't have it going on. Aren't the police doing anything? I suppose so, but I think we ought to take it in hand ourselves. We're not as well equipped as they are. Nonsense. We probably have far more sense and intelligence. A little determination is all that is needed. She said goodbye abruptly and went away. When Joanna and Megan came back from their walk, I showed Megan my Chinese picture. Her face lit up. She said, "It's heavenly, isn't it?" That is rather my opinion. Her forehead was crinkling in the way I knew so well. But it would be difficult, wouldn't it? To be idle? No, not to be idle, but to enjoy the pleasures of it. You'd have to be very old. She paused. I said, "He is an old man." "I don't mean old that way, not age. I mean old in... You mean," I said, "that one would have to attain a very high state of civilization for the thing to present itself to you in that way, a fine point of sophistication?" "I think I shall complete your education, Megan, by reading to you 100 poems translated from the Chinese." I met Symington in town later in the day. "Is it quite all right for Megan to stay on with us for a bit?" I asked. "It's company for Joanna. She's rather lonely sometimes with none of her friends." Oh, Megan? Oh, yes, very good of you." I took a dislike to Symington then which I never really quite overcame. He had so obviously forgotten all about Megan. I wouldn't have minded if he had actively disliked the girl. A man may sometimes be jealous of a first husband's child, but he didn't dislike her. He just hardly noticed her. He felt towards her much as a man who doesn't care much for dogs would feel about a dog in the house. You notice it when you fall over it and swear at it, and you give it a vague pat sometimes when it presents itself to be petted. Symington's complete indifference to his stepdaughter annoyed me very much. I said, "What are you planning to do with her?" "With Megan?" He seemed rather startled. "Well, she'll go on living at home. I mean, naturally it is her home." My grandmother, of whom I had been very fond, used to sing old-fashioned songs to her guitar. One of them I remembered ended thus: "O maid most dear, I am not here. I have no place, no part, no dwelling more by sea nor shore, but only in your heart." I went home humming it. Emily Barton came just after tea had been cleared away. She wanted to talk about the garden. We talked garden for about half an hour. Then we turned back towards the house. It was then that, lowering her voice, she murmured, "I do hope that she hasn't been too much upset by all this dreadful business." "Her mother's death, you mean?" "That, of course. But I really meant the unpleasantness behind it." I was curious. I wanted Miss Barton's reaction. "What do you think about that? Was it true?" "Oh, no, surely not. I'm quite sure that Mrs. Symington never... that he wasn't..." Little Miss Emily Barton was pink and confused. "I mean, it's quite untrue, although, of course, it may have been a judgment." "A judgment?" I said, staring. Emily Barton was very pink, very Dresden china shepherdess-like. "I cannot help feeling that all those dreadful letters, all the sorrow and pain they have caused, may have been sent for a purpose." "They were sent for a purpose, certainly," I said grimly. No, Mr. Burton, you misunderstand me. I'm not talking of the misguided creature who wrote them. Someone quite abandoned that must be. I mean that they have been permitted, by Providence, to awaken us to a sense of our shortcomings. Surely, I said, the Almighty could choose a less unsavoury weapon. Miss Emily murmured that God moved in a mysterious way. No, I said, there's too much tendency to attribute to God the evils that man does of his own free will. I might concede you the devil. God doesn't really need to punish us, Miss Barton. We're so very busy punishing ourselves. What I can't make out is why anyone should want to do such a thing. I shrugged my shoulders. A warped mentality. It seems very sad. It doesn't seem to me sad. It seems to me just damnable, and I don't apologise for the word. I mean just that. The pink had gone out of Miss Barton's cheeks. They were very white. But why, Mr. Burton? Why? What pleasure can anyone get out of it? Nothing you and I can understand, thank goodness. Emily Barton lowered her voice. They say that Mrs. Cleet, but I really cannot believe it. I shook my head. She went on in an agitated manner. Nothing of this kind has ever happened before, never in my memory. It has been such a happy little community. What would my dear mother have said? Well, one must be thankful that she has been spared. I thought from all that I heard that old Mrs. Barton had been sufficiently tough to have taken anything, and would probably have enjoyed this sensation. Emily went on. It distresses me deeply. You've not had anything yourself? She flushed crimson. Oh, no, indeed. Oh, that would be dreadful. I apologised hastily, but she went away looking rather upset. I went into the house. Joanna was standing by the drawing-room fire, which she had just lit, for the evenings were still chilly. She had an open letter in her hand. She turned her head quickly as I entered. Jerry, I found this in the letterbox, dropped in by hand. It begins, You painted trollop. What else does it say? Joanna gave a wide grimace. Same old muck. She dropped it onto the fire. With a quick gesture that hurt my back, I jerked it off again just before it caught. Don't, I said, we may need it. Need it? For the police. Superintendent Nash came to see me the following morning. From the first moment I saw him, I took a great liking to him. He was the best type of CID county superintendent. Tall, soldierly, with quiet reflective eyes and a straightforward, unassuming manner. He said, Good morning, Mr. Burton. I expect you can guess what I've come to see you about. Yes, I think so. This letter business. He nodded. I understand you had one of them. Yes, soon after we got here. What did it say exactly? I thought a minute, then conscientiously repeated the wording of the letter as closely as possible. The superintendent listened with an immovable face, showing no signs of any kind of emotion. When I had finished, he said, I see. You didn't keep the letter, Mr. Burton? I'm sorry, I didn't. You see, I thought it was just an isolated instance of spite against newcomers to the place. The superintendent inclined his head comprehendingly. He said briefly, A pity. However, I said, my sister got one yesterday. I just stopped her from putting it in the fire. Thank you, Mr. Burton. That was thoughtful of you. I went across to my desk and unlocked the drawer in which I had put it. It was not, I thought, very suitable for partridge's eyes. I gave it to Nash. He read it through. Then he looked up and asked me, Is this the same in appearance as the last one? I think so, as far as I can remember. The same difference between the envelope and the text? Yes, I said, the envelope was typed. The letter itself had printed words pasted onto a sheet of paper. Nash nodded and put it in his pocket. Then he said, I wonder, Mr. Burton, if you would mind coming down to the station with me. We could have a conference there, and it would save a good deal of time and overlapping. Certainly, I said. You would like me to come now? If you don't mind. There was a police car at the door. We drove down in it. I said, Do you think you'll be able to get to the bottom of this? Nash nodded with easy confidence. Oh, yes, we'll get to the bottom of it all right. It's a question of time and routine. They're slow, these cases, but they're pretty sure. It's a matter of narrowing things down. Elimination, I said. Yes, and general routine. Watching post boxes, examining typewriters, fingerprints, all that. He smiled. As you say. At the police station, I found Symington and Griffith were already there. I was introduced to a tall, lantern-jawed man in plain clothes, Inspector Graves. Inspector Graves, explained Nash, has come down from London to help us. He's an expert on anonymous letter cases. Inspector Graves smiled mournfully. I reflected that a life spent in the pursuit of anonymous letter writers must be singularly depressing. Inspector Graves, however, showed a kind of melancholy enthusiasm. They're all the same, these cases, he said in a deep, lugubrious voice like a depressed bloodhound. You'd be surprised. The wording of the letters and the things they say. We had a case just on 2 years ago, said Nash. Inspector Graves helped us then. Some of the letters I saw were spread out on the table in front of Graves. He had evidently been examining them. Difficulty is, said Nash, to get hold of the letters. Either people put them in the fire, or they won't admit to having received anything of the kind. Stupid, you see, and afraid of being mixed up with the police. They're a backward lot here. Still, we've got a fair amount to get on with, said Graves. Nash took the letter I had given him from his pocket and tossed it over to Graves. The latter glanced through it, laid it with the others, and observed approvingly, very nice indeed. It was not the way I should have chosen to describe the epistle in question, but experts, I suppose, have their own point of view. I was glad that some screed of vituperative and obscene abuse gave somebody pleasure. We've got enough, I think, to go on with, said Inspector Graves, and I'll ask you gentlemen if you should get any more to bring them along at once. Also, if you hear of someone else getting one, you in particular, Doctor, among your patients, do your best to get them to come along here with them. I've got, he sorted with deft fingers amongst his exhibits, one to Mr. Symington, received as far back as 2 months ago, one to Dr. Griffith, one to Miss Grinch, one written to Mrs. Mudge, the butcher's wife, one to Jennifer Clark, barmaid at the Three Crowns, the one received by Mrs. Symington, this one now to Miss Burton, oh yes, and one from the bank manager. Quite a representative collection, I remarked, and not one I couldn't match from other cases. This one here is as near as nothing to one written by that milliner woman. This one is the dead spit of an outbreak we had up in Northumberland, written by a schoolgirl they were. I can tell you, gentlemen, I'd like to see something new sometimes instead of the same old treadmill. There is nothing new under the sun, I murmured. Quite so, sir. You'd know that if you were in our profession. Nash sighed and said, Yes, indeed. Symington asked, Have you come to any definite opinion as to the writer? There are certain similarities shared by all these letters. I shall enumerate them, gentlemen, in case they suggest anything to your minds. The text of the letters is composed of words made up of individual letters cut out of a printed book. It's an old book, printed, I should say, about the year 1830. This has obviously been done to avoid the risk of recognition through handwriting, which is, as most people now nowadays, a fairly easy matter. The so-called disguising of a hand not amounting to much when faced with expert tests. There are no fingerprints on the letters, and envelopes are of a distinctive character. That is to say, they have been handled by the postal authorities, the recipient, and there are other stray fingerprints, but no set common to all, showing therefore that the person who put them together was careful to wear gloves. The envelopes are typewritten by a Windsor 7 machine, well worn, with the A and the T out of alignment. Most of them have been posted locally or put in the box of a house by hand. It is therefore evident that they are of local provenance. They were written by a woman, and in my opinion a woman of middle age or over, and probably, though not certainly, unmarried. We maintained a respectful silence for a minute or two. Then I said, The typewriter's your best bet, isn't it? That oughtn't to be difficult in a little place like this." Inspector Graves shook his head sadly and said, "That's where you're wrong, sir." "The typewriter," said Superintendent Nash, "is unfortunately too easy. It's an old one from Mr. Symington's office, given to him by the Women's Institute, where, I may say, it's fairly easy of access. The ladies here all often go into the Institute." "Can't you tell something definite from the touch, don't you call it?" Again Graves nodded. "Yes, that can be done, but these envelopes have all been typed by someone using one finger." "Someone, then, unused to the typewriter?" "No, I wouldn't say that. Someone, say, who can type but doesn't want us to know the fact." "Whoever writes these things has been very cunning," I said slowly. "She is, sir, she is," said Graves, "up to every trick of the trade." "I shouldn't have thought one of these bucolic women down here would have had the brains," I said. Graves coughed. "I haven't made myself plain, I'm afraid. Those letters were written by an educated woman." "What, by a lady?" The word slipped out involuntarily. I hadn't used the term lady for years, but now it came automatically to my lips, re-echoed from days long ago, and my grandmother's faint, unconsciously arrogant voice saying, "Of course, she isn't a lady, dear." Nash understood at once. The word lady still meant something to him. "Not necessarily a lady," he said, "but certainly not a village woman. They're mostly pretty illiterate down here, can't spell, and certainly can't express themselves with fluency." I was silent, for I had had a shock. The community was so small. Unconsciously, I had visualised the writer of the letters as a Mrs. Cleet or her like, some spiteful, cunning half-wit. Symington put my thoughts into words. He said sharply, "But that narrows it down to about half a dozen people in the whole place." "That's right. I can't believe it." Then, with a slight effort and looking straight in front of him, as though the mere sound of his words was distasteful, he said, "You have heard what I stated at the inquest. In case you may have thought that the statement was actuated by a desire to protect my wife's memory, I should like to repeat now that I am firmly convinced that the subject matter of the letter my wife received was absolutely false. I know it was false. My wife was a very sensitive woman, and well, you might call it prudish in some respects. Such a letter would have been a great shock to her, and she was in poor health." Graves responded instantly. "That's quite likely to be right, sir. None of these letters show any sign of intimate knowledge. They're just blind accusations. There's been no attempt to blackmail, and there doesn't seem to be any religious bias, such as we sometimes get. It's just sex and spite, and that's going to give us quite a good pointer towards the writer." Symington got up. Dry and unemotional as the man was, his lips were trembling. "I hope you find the devil who writes these soon. She murdered my wife as surely as she'd put a knife into her." He paused. "How does she feel now, I wonder?" He went out, leaving that question unanswered. "How does she feel, Griffith?" I asked. It seemed to me the answer was in his province. "God knows. Remorseful, perhaps. On the other hand, it may be that she's enjoying her power. Mrs. Symington's death may have fed her mania." "I hope not," I said with a slight shiver, "because if so, she'll—" I hesitated, and Nash finished the sentence for me. "She'll try it again? That, Mr. Burton, would be the best thing that could happen for us. The pitcher goes to the well once too often, remember." "She'd be mad to go on with it," I exclaimed. "She'll go on," said Graves. "They always do. It's a vice, you know. They can't let it alone." I shook my head with a shudder. I asked if they needed me any longer. I wanted to get out into the air. The atmosphere seemed tinged with evil. "There's nothing more, Mr. Burton," said Nash. "Only keep your eyes open and do as much propaganda as you can. That is to say, urge on everyone that they've got to report any letter they receive." I nodded. "I should think everyone in the place has had one of those foul things by now," I said. "I wonder," said Graves, He put his sad little head on one side and asked, "You don't know definitely of anyone who hasn't had a letter?" What extraordinary question. The population at large isn't likely to take me into their confidence. No, Mr. Burton, I didn't mean that. I just wondered if you knew of any one person who definitely, to your certain knowledge, has not received an anonymous letter. Well, as a matter of fact, I hesitated. I do, in a way. And I repeated my conversation with Emily Barton and what she had said. Graves received the information with a wooden face and said, "Well, that may come in useful. I'll note it down." I went out into the afternoon sunshine with Owen Griffith. Once in the street, I swore aloud. What kind of place is this for a man to come to lie in the sun and heal his wounds? It's full of festering poison, this place, and it looks as peaceful and as innocent as the Garden of Eden. Even there, said Owen dryly, there was one serpent. Look here, Griffith, do they know anything? Have they got any idea? I don't know. They've got a wonderful technique, the police. They're seemingly so frank and they tell you nothing. Yes, Nash is a nice fellow, and a very capable one. If anyone's batty in this place, you ought to know it, I said accusingly. Griffith shook his head. He looked discouraged, but he looked more than that. He looked worried. I wondered if he had an inkling of some kind. We had been walking along the high street. I stopped at the door of the house agents. I believe my second instalment of rent is due, in advance. I've got a good mind to pay it and clear out with Joanna right away. Forfeit the rest of the tenancy. Don't go, said Owen. Why not? He didn't answer. He said slowly after a minute or two, After all, I dare say you're right. Lymstock isn't healthy just now. It might harm you or your sister. Nothing harms Joanna, I said. She's tough. I'm the weakly one. Somehow this business makes me sick. It makes me sick, said Owen. I pushed the door of the house agents half open. But I shan't go, I said. Vulgar curiosity is stronger than pusillanimity. I want to know the solution. I went in. A woman who was typing got up and came towards me. She had frizzy hair and simpered, but I found her more intelligent than the speckled youth who had previously held sway in the outer office. A minute or two later, something familiar about her penetrated through to my consciousness. It was Miss Grinch, lately Symington's lady clerk. I commented on the fact. "You were with Galbraith and Symington, weren't you?" I said. Yes, indeed, but I thought it was better to leave. This is quite a good post, though not quite so well paid. But there are things that are more valuable than money, don't you think so?" "Undoubtedly," I said. "Those awful letters," breathed Miss Grinch in a sibilant whisper. "I got a dreadful one about me and Mr. Symington. Oh, terrible it was, saying the most awful things. I knew my duty and took it to the police, though of course it wasn't exactly pleasant for me, was it?" No, most unpleasant. But they thanked me and said I had done quite right. But I felt that, after that, if people were talking, and evidently they must have been, or where did the writer get the idea from, then I must avoid even the appearance of evil, though there has never been anything at all wrong between me and Mr. Symington. I felt rather embarrassed. No, of course not. But people have such evil minds. Yes, alas, such evil minds. Nervously trying to avoid it, I nevertheless met her eye, and I made a most unpleasant discovery. Miss Grinch was thoroughly enjoying herself. Already once today I had come across someone who reacted pleasurably to anonymous letters. Inspector Graves's enthusiasm was professional. Miss Grinch's enjoyment I found merely suggestive and disgusting. An idea flashed across my startled mind. Had Miss Grinch written these letters herself? Well, I wonder, had Miss Grinch written those letters? You'll find out in the next part of the story. Anyway, thanks for joining me today. See you next time.